Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Illinois Stories. I'm Mark McDonald in Hannibal, Missouri, the inspiration for some of Mark Twain's most famous writings. And, you know, when you're taking care of a piece of history like this, I think you find out over the years that things continue to change because you keep learning and you find homes like we're going to be talking about today and businesses, and you say, well, these things need to be protected and they need to be part of the story. And that's exactly what's going on in Hannibal. It continues to change, and what we're doing here today is bringing you up to date on some of the most recent changes in the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum operation. And Henry Sweet, this is fascinating because we say history, oh, it doesn't change. But we learn more about it as we go, don't we? Especially with these two buildings.
Well, there's always more to learn. And in terms of interpreting for the public, that's fun because you can change the story by adding to it and bringing out a lot more about the people and the events that were taking place here.
We're looking at these two buildings, the bigger of the two, the one that's on Main Street down there. This is significant because you have just completed this project, and this project was a big one because this building was not in very good shape, was it?
That is correct. This corner building is known as the Pilaster House. The flat columns on the outside of the building are pilasters. And local history says that the building was brought to Hannibal in 1836 in a knockdown fashion. It was actually intended for Marion City, just upriver, but Marion City was under floodwaters, so the timbers were unloaded here and the building was erected here. So that's a very early Hannibal building. And the building is important for the Mark Twain Museum for several reasons. First of all, the time period that the building dates back to is important, and the Greek Revival structure is very unusual for this part of the country. So it is architecturally an important building. But during the time the Clemens family were here, Mark Twain says that Dr. Grant and his family lived upstairs. And when John Marshall Clemens went bankrupt in the late 1840s.
Now this is Samuel Clemens' father,
yes,
right?
Okay. John Marshall Clemens is Samuel Clemens, or Mark Twain's father. When he went bankrupt, the family moved across the street and upstairs with the Grants. So it was a living quarters for the Clemens family for a short period. And then in the spring of 1847, Mr. Clemens rode to Palmyra, Missouri, our county seat, on horseback, was caught in a sleet storm and developed pneumonia and died in one of those upstairs rooms. Shortly after that, Mrs. Clemens was able to move the family back across the street into the boyhood home. But the Pilaster House does have that distinction of having been another residence for the Clemens family here in town.
As we stand here, this is going to be a part of your exhibit for his showing his life, Samuel Clemens' life, but it has not even been open to the public yet, so we get kind of a sneak preview.
That is correct. We've been spending the last year and a half on the restoration of the building. And we're very close to being ready to open it. It'll be open by the spring for the visitors coming through. And we're going to repeat what they did when they fixed the building up back in the 1950s, when it first became a museum property, that we're going to have a drugstore on the first floor. There is good evidence that Dr. Grant did also operate a drugstore here in Hannibal. And when they fixed it up and opened it around 1960, they had Grant's Drugstore on the first floor. So you may hear the building referred to both as Grant's Drugstore and the Pilaster House.
All right, and now right next door, this project is a little older. I mean, you undertook this one and finished it some time ago. But this was a very interesting building because this is where Mr. Clemens had his practice. He was a justice of the peace. But it wasn't always here. It got moved here, didn't it?
Well, we know of two buildings that Mark Twain's father used when he was a justice of the peace here in town, this being one of them. And it was a block over and closer to the river. And in 1950s, when the Pilaster House was given to the city, the piece of land next to it was also given, and the Justice of the Peace Office was moved here to preserve the building. So it's the only historic building in downtown Hannibal that's actually been moved from its original location.
Okay, so but this is where his father actually worked and made his living. Okay, and then it's very interesting that he fell on hard times and the family had to move from this boyhood home here to the upstairs of the doctor's office. Very interesting piece of history, and you'll also have at some point have that second floor open for interpretation as well. Is that right?
Yes, when we're completed with the project, the visitors will enter off the mall area here to tour the building, and they can go upstairs and visit the quarters up there where both the Grants and the Clemens family lived. And we've got a problem that we really don't have descriptions of what the property was like and how it was being used, what furniture was there, who was in what room. But we are going to have one room that will be a doctor's office up there, because we know at a different time Dr. Grant and Dr. Anderson had a joint practice on the second floor of a building down here. So we will have a doctor's office up there. Then we'll have a bedroom that will help to convey how crowded it was when you had two families living in that space upstairs. Then we will go into Mark Twain's writings and some of the history of the time period, and he describes incidents that happened while they were up there with the Grants, and we'll be able to portray those for our visitors. Then we'll take a look at John Marshall Clemens, Mark Twain's father, and how you would go bankrupt in those days, and then what happened to a family when you went through bankruptcy. We'll also take a look at Jane Clemens, who it appears came over and helped board the Grants as part of the arrangement for their living with the Grants. And what were her trials and tribulations? What was her workload? And what was she thinking of with the family? And what did she do after her husband died? So we'll be able to take a look at a lot of kind of societal issues while we're upstairs there also. Then the visitors will come down to the first floor, and we are going to have a pharmacy in there. As we know, Dr. Grant had a pharmacy here in Hannibal. We'll also be talking about the medical practices of the day. And I think people will find it a little disturbing to think about what was going on.
That's scary stuff, you bet. Now, when you undertook these projects, these buildings were in really sorry condition, and I'd like to spend the next few minutes showing people what had to be done to bring them up to the standard that they are now. So can we go take care of that?
We sure can.
All right. Henry, the Grant Drugstore building that we visited, you know, it had a lot of functions in prior years, didn't it?
As we go back looking through the city directories, there were many different businesses that were in it from time to time. And actually, when you look at the front of the building, there are two doors, and there was a division in there, and sometimes there were even two businesses in the building.
You'll also notice that on this very old picture, it had a balcony and a porch on it.
From the earliest times, there was a balcony out in front of the second floor, and there's a pair of doors up there to take you out onto the balcony. Then as we move forward through time, we have some pictures out of the 1940s that show the building when it was a restaurant. And you can see that not only is the balcony gone, but the door that was up there onto the balcony is also missing and has been replaced by a window. And it stayed like that for quite a number of years. We have a picture from the late 40s when it's a grocery store on the first floor. And again, no balcony up there. Then when the building was given to the city of Hannibal and it was fixed up and prepared to be part of the Mark Twain Museum, when it was opened about 1960, they put a balcony and porch back on the second floor, put the door back in to bring people out onto that balcony, and then fixed up the first floor as Dr. Grant's drugstore. So this is the condition that we had the building in when we began the operation of stabilizing and refurnishing the building.
It's interesting, I don't mean to stop you, but throughout these years, the pilasters, they were able to keep those through almost all of these.
Yes, that architectural element of the pilasters or flat columns stayed intact through all this transition.
And you certainly wanted to keep those in this latest incarnation of it, didn't you?
We wanted to return it close as we could to what it looked like originally.
And that was a real job, because look at what you had to almost just disassemble it completely. Look at this here.
When we started on the project, if you walked across the second floor, the floor definitely had a dip in it. And we knew that things had settled a lot. Floodwaters had gotten into the building through the years, groundwater, just a lot of deterioration. And so we took the building apart to the interior timbers. We took all the siding off, we took the plaster and walls off on the inside and got the building down to its basic structure. Then when we started leveling, the front of the building had to be raised 8 inches to bring the second floor level again.
Oh my goodness, 8 inches.
And once we had that set up, we had filled the basement with rock and poured a concrete slab over the top of it. So we had a good solid base, and we added new timbers in there next to the old ones to give the support that we needed for the visitor flow we're going to have. And so today the building is much closer to plumb than it has been for a long, long time.
How did you get it up 8 inches? What sort of tools did you use for that?
Well, actually we used hand jacks, old railroad jacks, and a team of men came in and were able with those to slowly move it up, and using laser levels we were able to bring things back to fairly plumb.
Now, we also visited the Justice of the Peace building, and I like this oldest picture that we see because this is where you told us that it was moved. It had to be moved next door onto your property. This is when it was blocks away, huh?
The Justice of the Peace building was about a block and a half away over on Bird Street. And this picture shows what it looked like shortly before it was moved up onto the museum mall. Then we have a picture that shows it as it had been portrayed since the 1950s. And among other things, one of the windows on the front had become a small, narrow window. When we got to work on the building had an uphill lean to the building that we had to correct. So again, we went to the structural timbers, brought it back together, and have reassembled it so that it's very plumb and very stable again for the future.
That's great, Henry. Well, let's take a look and see what they look like now. Okay, Henry, so you walk in off the mall, and we're in the drugstore now, Grant's Drugstore, or the Pilaster House, right? And this would have all been drugstore area at the time.
Yes, this would have all been one store back in those early days. And what we've done is arrange a large area for the visitors to stand in to look at the displays. And on the one hand, we have a drugstore set up with the pharmacist's bench there and the many bottles of chemicals and herbs and materials that they would have used in compounding the medicines. Then out in this larger area, we're going to have several audiovisual programs for the visitors to watch. We're going to have some cases with some of the early medical instruments, because Dr. Grant is a doctor as well. So in addition to the drugstore, we're also looking at medicine at those early days.
Now, was it unusual for a doctor to also be a pharmacist, or did they go together?
I think many times they did go together. When we take a look at Dr. Grant's training, he had a lot of pharmacy in his training. So it would be natural for him to be able to run the drugstore as well.
And now his practice he lived upstairs. Or did he practice medicine upstairs?
Mark Twain says that he was living upstairs here when the family had to move over here. We know that he had a doctor's office with another doctor as a joint practice on the second floor of a building here. So we are going to have one of the rooms upstairs as the doctor's office.
Okay, so you're assuming that he practiced medicine upstairs and that the Twains also lived upstairs in a different part of the floor, right?
Well, unfortunately, the historical records just don't tell us all the detail that we would like to have. We don't know that Dr. Grant actually practiced medicine upstairs, but it's appropriate for us to talk about that as we're doing the interpretation.
Sure. It probably wasn't on this level, though. This was probably an area for, and so you'll have interpretive materials down here too.
Right, throughout this first floor, we will have interpretive materials. We'll have text panels, we'll have video screens, we'll have some small cases with medical instruments, and talk about some of the medicines like Perry Davis's painkiller medicine that Mark Twain refers to in Tom Sawyer. That's the medicine Aunt Polly's dosing Tom with. And we actually have some bottles of that medicine and can talk about things like that.
So it actually existed, and you've actually found some samples of it?
It was a medicine that started in 1839 and was still being marketed into the 1960s.
I'll be darned. I thought it was probably just made up.
No, it's a real medicine.
Okay. So what I'd like to do, if it's okay, and I know you won't be inviting people to go through the drugstore area, but can we sneak in there and take a look around?
We can certainly sneak inside. We have it set up on a temporary basis right now. We're working on the permanent exhibits, and we hope to have those open in April of next year.
Okay, well let's go around to
We're
the street.
going to
and
take a look.
Okay, so entrance off Main Street. This will not be what the public's allowed to do, but thank you, Henry, for allowing us to come in here anyway. This will be off limits, but they can see in through the window that we were just that we could view.
Correct. We're behind the display window now in the area that will be Grant's Drugstore. And as we're standing here, you can see shelves that are full of bottles. Some medicines came pre-made. There were patent medicines such as Perry Davis's painkiller that were available at that time. But for the most part, the pharmacist was making specific medications for the doctor's orders. And so you have bottle after bottle that are full of different ingredients. Many herbs and plants were used for the medicines. You had to have alcohol, you had to have the different liquids that would be used in the medicines. And these would all have to be on hand in the pharmacist's drugstore. So we see that it was quite a process to make these medicines. When the doctor prescribed something, if he wanted these to come in the form of pills, the pharmacist would put the different ingredients together in a mortar and pestle, grind them to make sure that everything was uniform, put in a binder to hold everything together, and once it was thoroughly mixed, he would take that and roll it into a shape kind of like a pencil, lay it on this device, which is called a pill roller, and then by just pushing the top across here, it took that medicine and rolled it into uniform little balls. So you could make your own pills at that time.
And they would drop off into here.
And they would just drop into here, and you
then
could
he would count them. If you needed 30, he'd count off 30 and put in a bottle, and away you go. Or a box, I guess. Like those are pill boxes right there, and some of those pills came from a factory of some kind, I guess.
Exactly.
There's some other things on the counter here too, Henry, that's interesting. And before we even get to those, the counter itself is a piece of Hannibal history, isn't it?
Well, the counter that's in here actually came from one of the tobacco factories here in Tanla. And this top board is one solid piece of lumber, which is a huge board to have been able to
must be
prepare at that
14
time.
or 15 feet long, and it's almost 3 feet wide.
Yes. Yeah. And what we're looking at right now is just a temporary exhibit that we put up while we were working on the permanent exhibit. So there will be a lot more material in here. But you know, we have, of course, balances and scales because all the ingredients had to be weighed.
Like this here.
We have a cork sizer because the hand-blown bottles didn't have uniform necks on the bottles, and you'd have to take a piece of cork and squeeze it or shape it to fit the bottle.
Sure.
You know, mortars and pestles that they used, alcohol burners. We'll have much more of this sort of pharmacist tools out here as well.
This huge cabinet that holds everything back here that's a real find because that fits in here perfectly. And of course, it wasn't here originally, right?
No, the cabinet here is typical of the type of carpentry that we see in other pharmacies everywhere from Mystic Seaport to the Charleston Museum. We looked at a number of other pharmacies, and this sort of architecture on the cabinets is very common at that time.
Some of this is original, though, and I'm looking at this floor, this plank flooring. This was actually in here, and you were able to keep it, right?
When we worked on the building, we saved a lot of the original flooring, and in the doctor's pharmacy section, we do have the original flooring here for people to see.
And below the flooring, interesting story, because you found yourself with, okay, now this basement, there's a basement under here, but it's not deep enough for us to use for anything. So you kind of had a solution for that, didn't you?
Well, in downtown Hannibal, many of these buildings had basements that were only about 5 feet deep, and they just aren't usable. They also collect a lot of water during rains and so on. So we filled the basement with rock and poured a concrete slab on top of it for support. and then put the flooring back in. So we have the basement is unusable today, but is very structurally sound.
Yeah, it's going to hold everything up, isn't it? It's not going to sink.
No, it gives very good support for the upper floors.
One other thing that I always love to see original pieces, and the fireplace, of course, every building had to have at least one because that's how you heated, but this is the original fireplace.
This is the location where the fireplace was, and as far as we can tell, it is original to the building.
Very handsome. Henry, it's a very short walk, you know, a few yards down Main Street and then up to the mall to the Justice of the Peace House. Is that what you call it?
Yes, this is where Mark Twain's father, John Marshall Clemens, had an office when he was Justice of the Peace here in Hannibal.
And this is the one that you completed, restoring this one, am I right, about 4 years ago?
About 4 years ago, we were in the middle of this particular project, yes.
Okay, and also the Becky Thatcher house is what, right next door?
And the Justice of the Peace office is just downhill from the Becky Thatcher house and across the street from the Mark Twain boyhood home. This is one building that has been moved. It's not on its original location, but it was moved here in the 1950s to save the building because the building next to it was about to collapse.
Can we go in?
Sure.
So this is where his name was John Marshall Clemens. That was Samuel's father.
Correct.
This is where he practiced. Now, was he a lawyer? Is that what a Justice of the Peace was, or was that a different function?
Mark Twain's father had read law and was admitted to the bar back in Kentucky before the family moved out here to our state. Once he got here, we don't have records of him actually practicing law, but he was elected to be a Justice of the Peace. And as such, he upheld the local laws. And much of the work that he did as justice was settling disputes over debts that were owed, overdue notes. A lot of it was pretty boring. But he did, on occasion, have assault cases that would come to him. At least 2 different occasions, questions came up about slaves, and he had to mete out punishment to slaves for offenses that they had given to their masters. So he was actually kind of the local enforcer of the laws in terms of the court system at that time.
He was a municipal judge, and I guess there would have been a law enforcement officer. They actually made the arrests and everything, but he would have meted out any punishment that there was.
Oh yes, there was a local sheriff, and when somebody had to be brought to court, the sheriff was sent out to bring those people into court.
To Mr. Clemens. Okay.
Yes.
Now this is his workspace, or as close as you can sort of conceive of it. How did you furnish it?
Well, we have a couple of descriptions. One, Mark Twain describes a night that he had played hooky from school and snuck into his father's office to spend the night so he wouldn't go home and get a spanking. And so we do have a day bed or couch back here following that description from Mark Twain. Then there are some early descriptions of Mark Twain's father's courtroom that describe a large packing crate as his desk. And as you take a look around the room here, you'll see that we furnished it according to that description that we have from the 1840s.
So what you do is you really comb through the Twain writings, and that gives you clues, and you follow the clues, huh?
Very much so. We just don't have good descriptions of most of these buildings, and particularly of the how they were being occupied. So we just have to look for any clues we can find, and many times it's 2 or 3 words in a sentence somewhere that give you that hint.
There may be no way to track this down, or you may know or not know, but we've said that Mr. Clemens went bankrupt. And how would a public figure or a public employee like that go bankrupt? Well, did he have other business interests that we know?
First of all, the Justice of the Peace was not steady business. They held court about 4 times a year.
Oh, okay.
So between those court sessions, he actually clerked in stores. He ran a general store for a while himself. He was in other ventures that were really supporting the family. And he had some debts that were out, and a local merchant bought up his debts and tried to collect, and he didn't have the money to pay them, so they sold many of their furnishings and moved out of the boyhood home to settle those outstanding bills that he had.
I see. Okay, now are there any further plans for this building? This is interpreted this way, so the public can't be in among the furnishings. Are there any other plans for this building?
Yes, as we look into the next year, we're going to have some audiovisual presentations here. One that will talk about what a justice of the peace was and what his role was. And we do have the law ledger that covers about 1.5 years of the court cases that Judge Clemens oversaw that we can use for that information.
Oh, that'll be great.
We're going to have a program here on the Clemens family and slavery. The Clemens family owned slaves when they came to Hannibal, and Mr. Clemens, as justice, dealt with slaves on occasion. So we're going to have a short presentation on that. And then the scene that I described of Mark Twain staying overnight in the building here, we're going to have acted out for the visitors to see. So we will have several presentations here by this spring that are not here at the present moment.
Thank you, Henry. Grant's Drugstore, the latest addition to the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum, is expected to open to the public in April. With another Illinois story in Hannibal, I'm Mark McDonald. Thanks for watching.
Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Illinois Arts Council Agency, and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you. For a DVD copy of the program you've just seen, send 1995 to P.O. Box 6248, Springfield, Illinois 62708. Be sure to include the program name, subject, and when the program aired. You can also order with your credit card by calling 800-232-3605.